Welcome to Play the Man Podcast, a podcast seeking to build sturdy men in a wobbly world.
Welcome back to the Play the Man Podcast. Today we're with Pastor Shane Pennington and Pastor Peter Johnson, and I'm Zach Fink, and we're going to talk a little bit about the book of Nehemiah. And, we're in that book right now as a congregation, and I think we thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about, why Nehemiah right now, and get some additional insights from our pastors. So, Pastor Johnson, how did you come to choosing this particular book?
Well, you know that black 8-ball?
Yeah.
Yeah, and no black 8-ball was involved. Actually, I was thinking of this being the first book we would discuss when I was first called as the pastor, because we were a church plant, and it's kind of, so I was always thinking Nehemiah, but in the end I did. Our first book that we covered when I first got here was Galatians, but Nehemiah was always in my mind. And then I think we reached a point in our church, kind of where we're at now, where, our average attendance is about 200. There's just a lot of pressure to get systems mature, to get things in place. And I think, ironically, you almost feel that more now than in the beginning, when things kind of, you're so glad that just new people are coming, that's victory, but this idea of just building now that, the congregation, the size, the needs demand the infrastructure, and that kind of stuff. So there's a sense of building. But I think there are other factors too that I was thinking. I really like in Nehemiah, what we see as a book is this, one of my last sermon titles was True Biblical Worship Will Face Opposition, and we see that with Nehemiah. And, I think it's important to note, Nehemiah isn't just building a wall, right? I mean, Ezra was more into the worship and the spiritual aspects, but that isn't to say that Nehemiah isn't. But what he's doing is building a wall secure for the city so that, and later on we'll see him bringing in more people, so that worship, sacrifice, the priests, the temple, all this can function. What you're really looking at is a viable worshiping community. That's what he's building. And, what's Tobiah's, resistance to it? Well, I think he wants to be the big man in maybe a small pond. He wants to be in control. But the real issue is, I think he's a pawn from Satan. He's being used because Satan doesn't want this sort of building.
Yeah.
Satan doesn't want a community to gather together for the purpose of worshiping God. And so what opposition will we face as we've got a podcast. Who knows where this goes, right? And this could provoke opposition. People saying, hey, we don't like that. Well, how do we prepare for that? What's our mindset? How do we remain faithful from opposition, and opposition from without, right? From outside the camp, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But then, as we're going to see this Sunday, opposition from within. How does Satan stir the pot within the covenant community to bring opposition? Mm-hmm. So I think all these factors, they're very practical, so different from Romans, It's just a very practical application rather than, that dense 2-inch ribeye steak.
Yeah. I feel too like one of the things I think Nehemiah is so encouraging is when things feel like rubble, when things feel broken around you, which I think most of the time things do feel broken. And, I just kind of did a brief teaching series on Nehemiah for a men's Bible study a couple of years ago. And so it was pre-election cycle. Things felt more broken then, I think, than maybe they feel now. But you just looked around and things felt broken in our nation. Things felt broken in our churches. Things felt broken in our homes, And so this kind of idea of repairing the ruins is interesting, because I think we have that impulse. We want to repair things. We want to see it restored. But I just love where Nehemiah starts. It all starts at home. It's like it's not other people's fault. It's not projecting on anyone else. The way he starts off is, I've sinned.
Right.
Me and my household, we've sinned. We need to confess our sin. We need to pray. We need to. It all starts back local with getting my own house in order, getting my own sin confessed, and then it launches out into doing these incredible things of building the wall and facing the opposition and everything that's out there. And so I've always just thought it's extremely practical for that. Anything you're going to rebuild, you got to start with yourself. You got to start with your own house. And if we're going to rebuild our nation, it starts with our homes. It starts with our churches. And then it moves out. So
yeah, I agree. Could one of you guys talk a little bit about like the period of time for the Jewish nation at the time? Because I think one of the most interesting pieces of context is around the fact that they're exiles, right? Kind of, and they're and there's these books of the Bible, and there's like stories that are telling how different folks that are following God are doing it in different ways, right? Some are not able to return to Jerusalem. Some are trying to return. Some are, trying to rebuild. Some are not necessarily doing it that way. They're approaching this exile in a very different way. So, you can talk a little bit about like high level what's happening during that period of time to the Jewish nation and where they're headed, really, in like a larger context of the Old Testament.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, the Babylonian captivity, right? Where, earlier you had Assyria sack the northern kingdom. Then later on, Babylon comes in. Well, Babylon, let me back up you have the Assyrians hit Israel, right? But this is God's sovereign power of disciplining his children, but also the nations, right? So it's God who raises up Assyria that brings judgment upon Israel. It's God who raises up Babylon that brings judgment on Assyria, but also judgment on Judah. And then a large portion of Judah is exiled to Babylon. And then God raises up Persia to bring judgment on Babylon. But then you have characters like Cyrus, you have characters like Artaxerxes that are kings that have enormous power, but yet it's Cyrus who I think is the only Gentile ever referred to with a messianic title, right? So that's not to say that he becomes a believer in the one true God, but God is using Cyrus to now bless his people. And we see that with Artaxerxes. He's pretty commendable to what Nehemiah wants to do. Like he's appointed him as governor of Jerusalem. He's funded the expedition there. He's funded the campaign to rebuild. And so there's this aspect where favor is brought, to Nehemiah, to Ezra, to the people of Jerusalem. And now it's, we can even touch in a bit of Daniel there, but it's now the end of the 70 years, and God's people are returning to Jerusalem.
Yeah, and I don't know that we have an understanding of Nehemiah's motivations, right? But he seems like a man called to this time, and he seems very determined.
Well, there's a passion with him right from the beginning, right?
Yeah,
his brother comes to Susa and he hears news, and he's like, he's moved deeply.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's just emotional. There's like a audacity to Nehemiah. I need to go there and I need to fix it. If no one's going to do it, I'm going to do it. Yeah.
I think there's a phrase or something about both the opposition and the shame that like stirred him, right?
Yeah,
but then several times in the book, he says something about, the Lord put it on my heart to do this thing.
Lord, remember the good work that I'm doing.
Yeah,
He says that several times throughout the book. Yeah.
I think it is interesting though, just if you talk about Cyrus and things like that, of this all happening and the Lord using this in the context of very imperfect leaders and kings who may be unbelievers, but are, allowing Nehemiah to do what God's called him to do. It just has a lot of parallels. I mean, especially I think with where we're at right now, And so Peter and I have joked, about about calling Peter's series, "Make Jerusalem Great Again." And so it's a very imperfect leader. Go make Jerusalem great again. Rebuild the wall. It's like there's so many funny little parallel stories.
And even with Trump, I mean, where is Trump on his faith? I have no idea, right? I don't know. But the point, a lot of evangelical Christians are being criticized, this whole Christian nationalism that Trump is sort of the evangelicals' Messiah. And I think sober-minded Christians can think Trump could very well be an unbeliever, but that doesn't mean that God isn't using him like he used Cyrus, like he used Artaxerxes to bring good change to a nation.
Yeah. I think pragmatic leaders are, they're double-edged swords in a lot of different areas. And I think God uses pragmatic leaders, like leaders that want not to destroy, but to build up culture, right? And they see, you read in history all the time where, you might have a leader who's like, yeah, we should use a leader from those people to lead them because they'll listen to them and I don't want rebellion. Right? And it sounds it's a selfish political maneuver, but it's also good for the people ultimately to have their own, instead of him assigning, let's say, some other leaders from his ranks to go enforce something on a local culture. You see that a lot through antiquity and in history. And here, you have this Persian king who's favorable to Nehemiah, like you said, and he probably has, designs around helping that people prosper, maybe. We don't really know, but it wouldn't hurt his kingdom if they prospered.
Well, I was thinking okay, so Jerusalem is a portion of your kingdom that you conquered. You have a servant who's your cupbearer that says, I could be governor of Jerusalem and I could rebuild the walls. And you just think of, you're a leader, you're an empire, a king, that region is bad. I can either have a crumbled wall or I can rebuild it. But you know what? I'm not worried about rebuilding the wall because I own it all. But yeah, Nehemiah, go fix it. Because I could probably use that someday. And think about the tension that Sanballat and Tobiah are in. They can't just openly have this warfare. You can't have two fighting governors under a king, right? So, Cyrus, Artaxerxes isn't too worried about that because he's going to handle it. But hey, I got a guy who's going to. I think Artaxerxes, you're rebuilding my kingdom. I could use Jerusalem. I could put a detachment of soldiers there, and they already got a wall. Good, yeah, go do it. But it's all for God's purposes, right? It's not for Artaxerxes,
right?
Yeah. So anything, either one of you, and hoping that this opens up conversation with congregants around, the topics in Nehemiah, any things you think will be especially encouraging for folks?
Yeah, I think one thing, going to Solomon, Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so I think about, for the men of our church to really take a practical exercise at the leadership of Nehemiah. One, his faith, his quickness to pray. This is a strong man, right? He's a leader of men, yet he's very dependent on God, right? So there isn't this arrogance. There's this sense of, I need to be faithful to God. I need to be obedient, but yet I'm going to lead my people, right? And so there's a lot we can glean just from leadership. I think specifically men in our church. How do I lead my family? How do I build walls around my home? Good walls, right? How do I protect my home? I think there's, as we already discussed, what sort of opposition will we face? That opposition isn't new. It's just nuanced, right, in the 21st century. But we'll face it. God forbid, what if we have opposition from within? We will, right? We will have opposition from within. How do we handle that? What do we do? And the book of Nehemiah gives us some really practical paradigms for that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most practical books on biblical leadership that you could read. There's just so many things, and we may talk about this later. Just Nehemiah and his own personal life and all the traits that he exhibited that are so incredible. But and one of the things I really love about Nehemiah is that what he does is out of love for something. You know, it's out of love for his people. It's out of love for his country. It's out of love for his God. It's not reactionary, and it's not
Personal conquest.
yeah, it's not personal conquest, but it's also he's not being defined by what he's against, really, even though there's tons of opposition, but about what he's for.
Right.
And I think that's one of the beauties of the book as well, is that it's kind of like, this is what to do when you love your country. And if you don't have those things, it's really hard to rebuild. People who don't love their country, don't love their church, don't love their families, aren't going to build those things. Right. If they're just about what they're against, I don't want these things in my culture, I don't want these things in my home, I don't want these things in my nation, you're not going to build anything, right? And so you're going to be able to critique, you're going to be able to tear down, you're going to be able to have a voice, but you're not going to be able to build up. And so love kind of has to be first and has to drive it. And I think that's what's really beautiful about the book as well.
I completely agree. It seems very practical. It's very motivational, right? I think looking at a guy who has a fire in the belly is always, it's like, oh, that's cool, because he also exhibits great leadership traits. But it's obvious that he doesn't know necessarily what the next step always is, that he's relying on God to kind of guide him through opportunities. Things that open.
And that's it. We see that again and again in Nehemiah. It's kind of like what you said, Shane. It's like, okay, we got this rubble, right? It's all broken, right? But it's like he's not defined by that, and he trusts God to intervene, but he doesn't know when, and he doesn't know how.
Yeah.
But he just prays, puts a good plan in place that just sounds prudent, and then he's trusting God to come through. Nehemiah chapter 4 ends with what? They're sleeping with their boots on and with a weapon in their right hand, right?
Yeah.
Well, isn't God fighting for you? Yeah. That's why we're sleeping with our clothes and got a weapon in our right hand, right? It's...
I think it could be very encouraging for our seniors as well. And why I say that is because, kind of spoiler alert, right? The Nehemiah doesn't end as positively as you would like it to,
right?
And I mean, you may say more about this, Pastor, but it's, I think in some ways that's encouraging, that it's, Nehemiah is a type of Christ. He's this awesome leader, but he's not the fulfillment, and all that he was working on, all that he accomplished was amazing, and a lot of the physical accomplishments were there, but the spiritual accomplishments kind of, nosedived at the end. And I think it's just something that we tend to experience, is that a lot of times in our youth, we start off and it looks like we're doing this incredible thing, and we are a lot of times, and then we get to our end of our lives and we look back, and it's just not as satisfying as we hope. Yeah. And we don't really know what the outcome of all of our labors are. And and you just go back and read church history. You think of how many men in church history, good godly men, kind of were depressed at the end of their lives. I think of a Spurgeon, who just in the middle of the downgrade controversy, and the first half of his life was amazing and exciting. The second half of his life was it was disappointing in some ways. And
Jonathan Edwards gets voted out of his own church.
Yeah.
And like hundreds of years later, we're still reading Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah. I mean, I think we could say it about Machen. We could say it about, a lot of guys, right, where there were some exciting things going on, but overall there was this, end of their lives maybe wasn't as exciting as the first part, or weren't sure what they accomplished, And so I think for our seniors, that it really does put our ultimate hope on Christ, on the kingdom to come, the New Jerusalem and its walls, which are everlasting, all of those things. It focuses us there. And so I hope it's something that's encouraging to people who maybe are in the latter part of their life.
How Nehemiah ends. And, we need to talk about the end, because these are important principles throughout the book, where you really do see the gospel in Nehemiah, right? It's veiled, but it's there. So at the very last chapter, they have everything set up and the altar, and they're starting to worship, and they're waiting on the high priest, which is just metaphorical for you're waiting on the Messiah. Yet, just as you said, probably when Nehemiah gets to that point, right? This is when he's pulling hair out and he's all upset. It's like all this work and it's for nothing. But guess what? You aren't Christ, Nehemiah. You don't really bring any fulfillment, but the fulfillment is coming, and we're waiting for it, and it's Christ.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you guys for sharing. If you haven't listened to the sermon series, you can go get it, and catch up and, read the book. It's not that long, and it's a fascinating story, and be encouraged by it. So thanks, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Play the Man podcast. Stay sturdy, friends.